Okay, now you'll remember that I talked back in December about Apollo 8, and we went through the whole history of how really the space race had kicked off, starting at the Second World War and taking us up to the first spacecraft, manned spacecraft to go to the moon, Apollo 8. And of course that was just part of the program. This is, if you like, part 2 of a 3-part thing. I'm going to talk at the annual general meeting about Apollo 11, which is the first landing mission. But in between Apollo 8 going to the moon and Apollo 11 actually landing on it, there were 2 other very different missions, both involving Saturn V rockets, that actually got them into a position to go to the moon. So let's have a look at what Apollo 8 achieved. A great many things were achieved by the Apollo 8 thing. Of course, it didn't have a lunar module. So they were able to test the Saturn V rocket and verify that actually all of the stages of it worked and actually were capable of getting to the moon. The service propulsion rocket, the SPS rocket, on the command and service module got a good workout as well. And they knew that it fired more than once because they needed that to happen to get out of lunar orbit and return to Earth. And of course the command and service modules got a good workout as well and performed extremely well. However, because they didn't have a lunar module, they had done no tests with people and a lunar module. They'd flown it once on Apollo 5, unmanned, but actually that was a very incomplete spacecraft at that point because it wasn't sufficiently advanced to form part of Apollo 8. But with Apollo 9, they tested it. Likewise, they did a lot of work docking and navigation. They needed to dock the command and service module with the lunar module, and they did that on Apollo 9. Also, the first use of the life support backpacks to be used on the moon, that happened with Apollo 9 as well. And endurance. They really dragged the whole mission out to 10 days. Now, I've often thought when you look at it on the face of it, that Apollo 9 was kind of a waste of a Saturn V, really, in the grounds that you had a moon-capable rocket and you put it into low Earth orbit. That was what they did with it. They didn't need to go to the moon to do all the testing that they wanted to do with that. So that's what they did. Apollo 9. Let's have a bit of a look of it. 3 crew. Jim McDivitt was the commander, and that was his second and final space flight. Dave Scott was his second space flight. He also flew on Apollo later. And the lunar module pilot was Rusty Schweikart. That was his only space flight, his first and indeed his last. So not a hugely experienced crew, but well up to the task that needs to be done. Apollo 9 was just, there I've noted, Apollo Saturn 504. So it was the 4th Saturn V to actually be launched, the first being Apollo 4, the second being Apollo 6, and the third being Apollo 8. Apollo 9 was the 4th. Okay, and now the crew, that crew was originally destined for Apollo 8. But they had a certain amount of discussion about it, and it came down to the fact that Jim McDivitt wanted to fly the lunar module, and Frank Borman wanted to go to the moon. And so Deke Slayton, who was in charge of the astronaut office at that time, agreed that they could swap. And of course, that had a knock-on, because the idea was that the backup crew for each flight became the main crew for 3 missions later. And the backup crew for Apollo 8 was Armstrong and Aldrin, so they got Apollo 11. Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Al Bean being the backup for Apollo 9, they got Apollo 12, so they did the second mission to the moon. The second moon. It could all have been quite different were it not for that decision being made at that point. But here's a nice picture of I can't see my button here, right there. Of the 2 craft, the lunar module here and the command and service module docked in low Earth orbit. Now then, just let's run through some of the things that they did on Apollo 9. Orbital insertion. This comes back to what Terry was saying. Here's Now this is not the whole thing. The whole Saturn V thing is around 3,000 tons, whatever. But the command and service module is approximately, let's call that 22 metric tons, which is more or less the same as the Imperial tons, a little bit more or less, I forget which now. And the lunar module was 14 tons, 14.5 tons. They put this into a roughly 100-mile high orbit. No need to go to the moon, so no point in going any further than that. Inclined 32 degrees and with a orbital period of 88 minutes. So pretty much it's a bit of a lower orbit than the International Space Station is in, and therefore has a slightly shorter thing. The space station is 92 minutes and it's about 250 miles high, something like that. The lunar module and command and service module undocked and redocked with a few hours time between them, and they did 2 extravehicular activities, EVAs. That was Rusty Schweikart came out from the lunar module forward hatch for just over an hour, and Dave Scott came out of the command module side hatch again for just over an hour as well. So 2 EVAs, lots of docking, lots and lots of firing of rockets and stuff. They had to verify 7 times that SPS rocket would fire, the last of which being the re-entry burn, the deorbit burn. So and they also adopted at this point a little convention. Apollo 8 was Apollo 8 because it was only one spacecraft, but at a certain point these 2 spacecraft separated, and at which point they then adopted separate call signs, and in this case the command and service module was Gumdrop and the lunar module was Spider. Quite easy to see where they got Spider from. Not so sure about Gumdrop. So that was really Apollo 9. So Apollo 9 was a completely successful test, but much more of an engineering mission than the sort of the glamorous trip of Apollo 8 to the moon. But all needed to be done. So Apollo 10 was the full dress rehearsal. Apollo 10 went to the moon and actually got within 8.5 miles of the lunar surface before they decided not to land. Not that they were ever going to land, but they didn't, because that was their mission, was to actually do everything except actually land. Very experienced crew. Tom Stafford, 3rd space flight. John Young, 3rd space flight. Gene Cernan, 2nd space flight. And they all, of those 3, flew subsequent Apollos, with John Young and Eugene Cernan being mission commanders. Tom Stafford turned up on the Apollo Soyuz test mission of 1975, the very last of the Apollos. So very, very experienced crew there. They went into a low Earth orbit first before they went off to the moon. So that was a 100-mile high orbit, similar to Apollo 9. But then they did that translunar injection burn that got them to the moon. They went into a very elliptical orbit around the moon, 60 by 171 miles. And then they undocked the lunar module on the 22nd of May, 7 o'clock in the evening. And this is a photograph of the command and service module taken from the lunar module. They then took the lunar module right down to 47,400 feet. Right, they went to 8.5 miles from the moon, and then something very dangerous happened, and I'll leave Gene Cernan to explain it here.
Apollo 10 would be a dress rehearsal for the lunar landing. There were still a number of systems, including landing radar that could only be checked out above the lunar surface. In addition, Apollo 8 had detected some strange gravitational fluxes during their 10 orbits. These too would be investigated. The LEM, nicknamed Snoopy, separated from Command Module Charlie Brown. Stafford and Cernan's orders were clear. Follow the flight path down towards the landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. Come within some 50,000 feet of lunar soil. Then release the descent stage and rocket back into orbit.
We did everything that needed to be done except the landing itself, which made, I think, life a little bit more comfortable for the Apollo 11 crew, because the big challenge then was from 47,000 feet down to the deck.
Hello, Houston, Houston, this is Snoopy.
Roger, Snoop, go ahead.
We is going, we is down among them, Charlie.
Roger, I hear you weaving your way up the freeway.
Well, knowing a little bit about astronauts, I think that the idea of making that landing certainly crossed their minds. But knowing how disciplined they were and how much discipline was in this entire flight test program, it was not conceivable that it was going to happen.
When we made 2 passes over the lunar surface on Apollo 10 with the lunar module, separated from our command module several, I don't know, tens or hundreds of miles away, on the second pass, we then simulated what would have to be done on the surface, where you separate the 2 stages, fire the ascent engine, and we're on our way to a rendezvous. And we did that with the abort guidance system rather than the primary guidance system, just to check out everything. We also checked out the landing radar on that mission and found out that it had been programmed improperly, and had that happened on Apollo 11, they would not have landed. So we found out some interesting things on Apollo 10.
The landing rehearsal was nearly complete. All that remained was to separate from the descent stage of the LEM and fly back to the command module. Stafford began resetting the controls, unaware that Cernan had done exactly the same thing.
And I had all the switches set, and Tom instinctively, as we will do, will reach over there and change the position of the guidance switch, because he knew it had to be changed to AGS. Well, I had already changed it to AGS. And so when it fired, it was on a primary guidance system, and the primary guidance system didn't know where to tell it to go. So we did separate, we spun out of control.
The thing was tumbling and rolling all over the place. And they were really in trouble, and there was quite a few expletives broadcast to the world audience before they got it back under control. It was a pretty crazy moment.
I remember seeing a lunar horizon go by in different directions about 8 times in some 15 seconds. Tom took it back from the computer, got it under control. We gave it back to the abort guidance system. We got the burn on time when we rendezvoused, and everything turned out all right.
It was later determined that the lander had come within 2 seconds of crashing into the lunar surface before Stafford and Cernan regained control. Despite the few unnerving seconds, Apollo 10 had cleared a pathway almost down to the lunar surface. Snoopy's mission was over. The next LEM to fly was reserved for Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. It would be called the Eagle.
So there you have it. That's why you do testing, really, to find these things out. So had they not gone through all of that program with Apollos 9 and 10, there would have been no Apollo 11. You can't go straight to that there. So that's really all I have to say about 9 and 10. In 4 weeks' time at the AGM, we'll talk all about Apollo 11. So thank you very much. Right, now Terry has recently been